to respond to a series of articles written by Andrew Schumacher. He's a Christian teacher and apologist, and he runs the ministry The Beginning of Wisdom. I like Andrew. He seems like a really sharp thinker, and I think he's pretty fair in how he represents views that he disagrees with. I want to interact with Andrew's content because a lot of what he focuses on in his videos and articles is this issue of the Torah and its relevance to Christians today. Now, Andrew responds to a lot of the errors that he perceives within the Hebrew Roots movement, and of course, a big belief within that movement is the idea that the Torah is still valid and relevant to Christians. That is, this idea that we should still be keeping commandments like the Sabbath and dietary laws and so forth. So while Andrew does affirm the authority of what he calls moral laws, which all Christians agree with, commands like don't murder, steal, lie, and so forth, he disagrees that we should still follow laws like the Sabbath and dietary instructions. Now, full disclosure, I don't consider myself Hebrew roots. I'm often lumped in with them because I believe in things like keeping the Sabbath. I work for a ministry that is definitely considered by many to be Hebrew roots, and they use that term. But I personally don't like the term because it's so ill-defined. People have a million different ideas of what it is, and I simply don't agree with a lot of what I guess the Hebrew Roots movement has gained a reputation for. So I'm not defending the Hebrew Roots movement. I don't care what anyone thinks about that movement. I'm defending my theological belief that the Torah is still valid, that it's still authoritative, that it still has a role in our lives as Christians. Anyway, the series of articles I'm responding to is centered on Matthew 5:17 through 20. There's a link to these articles below, but this is a very important passage regarding the question of the Torah and its role in our lives as followers of Yeshua, Jesus. Obviously, the Messiah's direct statement on this matter is worthy of our attention, and Andrew himself recognizes this. Here's what he says. While there is much diversity in the Hebrew Roots movement, the one thing almost all have in common is the view that the law of Moses is still fully in effect for all Christians today. This is nuanced among different groups, but what is very common wherever you look is the view that Matthew 5:17 through 20 is clear teaching by Jesus that his coming does not change our obligation to keep the whole law. Now, from here, Andrew goes on to give his interpretation of this passage, and he explains why he thinks it does not affirm the ongoing authority of God's law. Before we address his arguments, let's go ahead and look at the passage. Matthew 5:17 through 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so Jesus says in Matthew 5:17 that he came to fulfill the Torah and the prophets, not abolish them. In his articles, Andrew takes the traditional position that fulfill, plurau, it essentially means bringing to completion. Since Yeshua embodies the whole of the Tanakh, the whole of the Old Testament, everything points to and culminates in him. And by virtue of this fulfillment, some laws like the Sabbath do not need to be kept anymore. They now function as signposts, if you will, that direct us to the Messiah. The way Andrew puts it is that our relationship to some laws has changed in light of their fulfillment. They don't apply to us in the same way anymore now that Christ has fulfilled them. By this he means we don't have to do things like literally rest from our work on the seventh day anymore. Of course, I agree that the Messiah came to perfect the Torah. He embodies the Torah to its fullest extent in his messianic work and in his teachings and deeds, but I believe it's an overstatement, a non sequitur really, to say that this fact therefore means that the Messiah rendered some laws inapplicable to us. Quite the opposite, actually, and the rest of the passage makes this very clear. I believe Yeshua saying he came to fulfill the Torah is an affirmation of the Torah's ongoing authority. Listen to what New Testament scholar Dr. Craig Keener says. When Jesus says that he came not to abolish the law and prophets, but to fulfill, he uses terms that would have conveyed his faithfulness to the scriptures. To fulfill God's law was to confirm it by obedience and demonstrating that one's teaching accorded with it. To annul it was to cast off its yoke, treating God's law as void. What Yeshua is saying here is that he came to confirm the Torah's validity and teach what it actually means to apply it properly the way God intends, which of course makes the most sense in light of the context. Yeshua's entire sermon is predicated on the idea that the Torah is still authoritative. And by the way, if you're interested in an excellent scholarly paper on this topic, there's one that was presented at ETS a while back, written by Tim Haig, and he demonstrates how the Greek "to fulfill" in this verse can have the meaning confirm or implement. So I'll leave a link to that below. In summary, Yeshua did not come to abolish the Torah, that is, tear it down or annul it, which Andrew agrees. Instead, he came to fulfill it. Now, Andrew thinks that this entails that some laws are now rendered non-authoritative to us. I disagree. I agree with scholars like Dr. Craig Keener and others that to fulfill the law means to confirm it and demonstrate how to properly live it out on the basis of love for God and one's neighbor. Listen to what Dr. Carmen Imes says in regard to this passage. She's an Old Testament scholar. She recently spoke at Dr. Michael Heiser's Naked Bible Conference. I know Andrew is a fan of Heiser because he mentions him in his article. But anyway, this is from her new book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. After quoting Matthew 5:17, she says this: "If anyone was hoping to be done with Sinai now that Jesus is here, this is the moment of truth. He upholds the law, telling the crowds that every commandment matters and that entrance to God's kingdom requires a righteousness even greater than that of the current Jewish religious leaders. He raises the bar by returning to the original intent of the Sinai instructions. You have heard that it was said, but I tell you." Jesus does not do away with the Old Testament law. He calls people back to it, and he holds them to it. Again, this is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. The religious leaders have failed to properly teach the people how to keep the Torah. Yeshua came to reveal how to keep the Torah as God originally intended at Sinai. We are to walk out the Torah on the basis of love for God and neighbor. Let's keep going, because this idea that Yeshua is actually affirming the ongoing authority of the Torah will become even clearer as we read through the rest of the passage. Matthew 5:18. "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Andrew doesn't really unpack what he thinks this verse means. He mainly just criticizes the pro-Torah interpretation of it. From what I could gather, though, he takes the position that all has already been accomplished through Christ's work on the cross, so now iotas and dots can pass away from the Torah. However, according according to Dr. Craig Keener, that interpretation violates the whole thrust of the passage. It's trying to force what you already believe onto the verse rather than just taking it for what it says. I really like how New Testament scholar Dr. J. Andrew Overman puts it. He calls Andrew's approach hermeneutical gymnastics, which is an awesome phrase that I've totally stolen and have used in other discussions. But listen to what he says. Quote, "A host of monographs have been devoted to these 4 verses, attempting to show that Jesus did not mean that the law must be fulfilled when he seemed to have said the law must be fulfilled. For example, some interpreters have found an escape clause in 5:18b, which concludes with the phrase, quote, until all is accomplished. Some have claimed that Jesus fulfilled all, and therefore the law and the prophets were enforced during Jesus' lifetime, but not after his death, since at that point all was accomplished. Such hermeneutical gymnastics seem excessive if not tortured. Such contrived interpretations of 5:17 through 20 are also a result of isolating these verses from the rest of the gospel. Indeed, throughout the gospel, Matthew demonstrates a sophisticated knowledge of the law, its interpretation, and the abiding validity of the law as he interprets it. Although this passage is the subject of lively controversy, it is unambiguous and does indeed command obedience to the whole Torah. Basically, Andrew's objection to the plain reading of the verse is to say that it contradicts Hebrews. His argument boils down to this, I'm paraphrasing. This verse can't mean that the Torah still has an authoritative role in the lives of Christians, because that would mean the Levitical priesthood and animal sacrifices are still to be performed. But that idea contradicts the book of Hebrews. The problem is that Andrew approaches Matthew 5:18 already assuming that his interpretation of Hebrews is correct. And so he reads his interpretation of Hebrews into Matthew 5:18 and says, oh, well, the time when all is accomplished must have already occurred. Now, obviously, I disagree with Andrew's interpretation of Hebrews, and if you're interested in some scholarly resources on the book of Hebrews that demonstrate that the author of Hebrews does not contradict what Yeshua says in Matthew 5:18, both Tim Hegg and J.K. McKee have written excellent commentaries. But since getting into the entire book of Hebrews is beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, I'll just leave it at that. I think we should take the plain sense of Matthew 5:18, which is that nothing will pass from the Torah until heaven and earth pass away and all is accomplished. According to scholars, Yeshua is making a reference to the eschaton here, that is, the end of the age and the consummation of the eternal kingdom when heaven and earth will pass away. But before we move on, what do we make about the parts of the Torah pertaining to the priesthood and sacrifices? Well, as Andrew points out, I'm among those who would say there's no reason to think the Levitical system has been annulled. For instance, the apostles continued to participate in the Levitical system long after Jesus' death and resurrection. The author of Hebrews himself recognized the ongoing service of the Levitical priesthood in Jerusalem. Furthermore, both Ezekiel and Zechariah acknowledge the reality of a future earthly priesthood, temple, Levites, and animal sacrifices during the millennial reign of Messiah. To be clear, Jesus is the high priest of a greater priesthood, as Hebrews clearly teaches. He is the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. The Levitical priesthood could not attain perfection because it was made up of fallen men, and animal sacrifices could not provide atonement because they could not provide the infinite payment for sin that only Messiah's sacrifice could fulfill. But it doesn't follow from any of these facts that the Levitical priesthood has been abolished. The Levitical priesthood has always functioned as the earthly shadow that points to the heavenly reality that Messiah fulfilled. It will function in that role again during the millennial reign when it's reestablished. So, there's no contradiction between Matthew 18 and the book of Hebrews. Andrew assumes his interpretation of Hebrews, which abolishes parts of the Torah, is the correct interpretation, and so he imposes that interpretation on Matthew 5:18. I agree with New Testament scholars that the plain sense of Matthew 5:18 is correct, and that Andrew is simply wrong in how he interprets Hebrews. So, let's go ahead and move on to the next verse. Matthew 5:19. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So the meaning of this verse is pretty straightforward. Here, Yeshua directly admonishes his followers to be great in the kingdom of heaven by doing and teaching the commandments. Which commandments? Well, the commandments that he's been talking about this entire time, the Torah. That's the context of this entire passage. Jesus says that those who do and teach the law will be great in the kingdom of heaven, and those who don't will be least. There's actually a polemic here against the religious leadership of Yeshua's day, which is, of course, made clearer in the next verse. But here's what New Testament scholar Dr. J. Andrew Overman writes. Quote, "The Jewish leadership is alluded to in 519a with the reference to the authoritative role of teaching. Those who teach others to do away with the law are least in the kingdom. For Matthew, teaching the law is bound up with doing it. On other occasions, Matthew claims that this is a distinction between his community and the Jewish leadership. Matthew's community understands, teaches, and does the law. This is the fulfillment of the law and the righteousness which surpasses that of the Matthean antagonists. If you not only teach the law but do it, applying the dominant principles of love and compassion, you have fulfilled the law and properly enacted the will of God in heaven. Love and mutuality, as seen in the antitheses, guide the interpretation of the valid and enduring law." Again, throughout his Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua is affirming the ongoing authority of the Torah, and he is teaching how to apply it properly. This is in contrast to the hypocritical Jewish leadership of the day who preached Torah but did not actually practice it. They found all sorts of ways to circumvent God's actual intention in his laws while still pretending to be religious, still pretending to be righteous. That's what Jesus is addressing in his sermon. His followers actually do and teach the Torah, unlike the religious authorities of the day. Now, Andrew actually has a very peculiar interpretation of verse 19. I've read a bazillion commentaries on Matthew, and I've never heard this explanation before. Basically, Andrew makes a distinction between the Torah and the commandments Jesus refers to in Matthew 5:19. Andrew argues that Yeshua does not admonish his followers to do and teach the commands of the Torah, but actually admonishes them to do and teach different commandments, namely the commands of Jesus. So Andrew escapes from the implications of the plain sense of this verse by saying that Jesus is introducing new and different commands here, and that's what he's referring to when he tells us to do and teach the commandments. However, this interpretation is highly unlikely due to the fact that the entire context of the passage is dealing with the law of Moses. Not only that, but Jesus' teaching throughout the entire Sermon on the Mount assumes the validity of the Torah. Now, Andrew appeals to the antitheses throughout the sermon to try to substantiate his point, the "you have heard it said, but I say to you" statements. Andrew says, quote, in his contrast regarding murder, adultery, and eye for eye, Jesus makes no reference to anything outside the law in the contrast. So Andrew's idea is that Jesus' teaching is contrasted with the law of God and therefore must be a different law. However, a much more parsimonious explanation that makes much more sense in light of the immediate context is what the scholars I quoted earlier have proposed. That is, that Jesus is offering the correct interpretation of the Torah, not issuing new and different commandments. He is explaining how to properly keep the Torah on the basis of love for God and neighbor. how to live as those who have the Torah written on the heart. Let's look at the last verse, Matthew 5:20. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so Andrew says here that Yeshua cannot be affirming the ongoing authority of the Torah in the previous 3 verses because that would mean that verse 20 would logically entail that salvation is on the basis of Torah observance, which we all know isn't true. Obviously, that idea would contradict the biblical teaching of salvation by grace through faith. So basically what Andrew is doing here is he's creating a false dilemma. Either you reject the plain sense of what Yeshua is saying in Matthew 5:17 through 19, that is, that the law still has an ongoing authoritative role in our lives as Christians, or you reject the biblical teaching of salvation by grace through faith. The first problem with Andrew's argument is that he faces the same dilemma because he interprets verse 19 as Jesus admonishing his followers to do and teach certain commandments. So either way, whether you think verse 19 means following the Torah in accordance with Jesus' interpretation of it, or following new and different commandments from Jesus, we are still left with this dilemma in verse 20. However, not to worry, because there is another option that allows us to affirm both the biblical doctrine of salvation by grace through faith and the plain sense of Matthew 5:17 through 19. Jesus is not talking about the doctrine of salvation, but about the natural outgrowth of saving faith, that is, living as a member of the kingdom of heaven. This could be compared to the Epistle of James. A lot of people will accuse James of teaching works-based salvation because of what he says in chapter 2 of his epistle about how faith alone can't justify, we also need to do good works. But James doesn't deny the fact that we're justified by faith. He doesn't teach that faith can't save us. He teaches that counterfeit faith can't save us. What is counterfeit faith? It's the kind of faith that doesn't lead to doing good works. So James affirms that we're saved by faith, but faith needs to be defined correctly. What James does is he emphasizes that doing good works is the necessary outgrowth of saving faith, as every Christian agrees. Yeshua is basically saying the same thing. Members of the kingdom of heaven, that is, those who have been saved by faith, by definition, they will walk in righteousness. Their righteousness doesn't save them, but those who have been saved, who are genuine members of the kingdom of heaven, they will walk in righteousness. If you're not walking in righteousness, you aren't a genuine member of the kingdom of heaven. Same thing as what James says. If you aren't doing good works, you don't have genuine faith. The righteousness of Yeshua's followers will exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees because our righteousness is based on Yeshua's fulfillment of the Torah, his embodiment of the Torah in his work and his teachings. Yeshua teaches us true Torah observance on the basis of love for God and neighbor. He writes the Torah on the hearts of his followers, transforming them from the inside out in accordance with the new covenant promises, as his entire Sermon on the Mount goes on to demonstrate. He teaches Torah from the heart. So, a plain sense reading of Matthew 5:20 is fully compatible with the biblical doctrine of salvation by grace through faith, just as James 2 is also fully compatible with that biblical doctrine. There's no reason to try to make Matthew 5:17 through 20 say something different than what it clearly says. In conclusion, Matthew 5:17 through 20 clearly affirms the ongoing validity and authority of the Torah. Yeshua came to confirm the Torah and embody it to its fullest extent, teaching how to properly apply it as God always intended. Not a single part of the Torah will pass away until the consummation of the kingdom at the end of the age, when heaven and earth pass away. Yeshua's followers will do and teach even the least of the commandments of the Torah, and members of the kingdom of heaven will have a righteousness that surpasses the scribes and Pharisees, those religious leaders who preach Torah but don't actually practice it. Their faith is dead, as James puts it. But as members of the kingdom, those who have been saved by grace through faith, who have genuine faith, who are genuine members of the kingdom, we will walk in righteousness in accordance with the revealed will of God in the scriptures, including the Torah, as Messiah affirmed and taught. Hey, I hope this video was a blessing to you. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Also, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified whenever I post more content like this. I hope you liked the video. Again, I'll see you next time. Blessings and shalom.